If you hear the word ritualism and what appears in your head is lace, then I think we've already missed the point. But also, if you hear the word ritualism and you imagine a man arguing about candles, all while the poor are starving outside, then I think we've missed it again. And if you hear ritualism and you think Rome, full stop, the end of story, then we haven't grasped what it really is. Because ritualism was many things, and some of them were admirable, some perhaps foolish, and some, if we're honest, were dangerous. But here's one of the important things: in the places that mattered most for this series, which are the slums, the docklands, the back streets, the overcrowded terraces, the black bits on booths, maps, really ritualism was not a hobby. It was a way of keeping Christian life from collapsing. Welcome to Empire of the Sun. I'm Matthew. If you like slow thinking history mixed with Christianity, then please like this video and subscribe to the channel. I keep being told by people that this really does help. Also, this is part one of a 12-part ritualism series where we'll hope to do one every week or so on a Thursday. And it's less about smells and bells and not approaching ritualism as sort of Roman Catholicism like, but it's about ritualism under pressure, especially the pressure in the slum priest world. So the arc is basically this: what did they think Christianity was? And what did that belief actually build? And what happens when the parish was full of poverty, disease, and conflict? And throughout the series, we'll do theology and institutions and backlash and mistakes, some of them large errors. And we'll keep asking the same question. The primary question is this dignity, or is this about control? And the ritualism strand that we're doing here sits in the wider project of Empire of the Sun, where I try and do something that people again keep telling me is very old-fashioned. I would like to look carefully at Christian history, about how it was actually lived, not from afar off, not as a war against 19th century culture, and not as a movie with heroes and villains, but I like to look at these real people making decisions under pressure. And this first episode is the doorway into the whole of the next 12 or 11 episodes. It's more than a single biography, and it won't avoid scandal. And it's a work, ritualism is a work throughout the 19th century Church of England. But behind all of that, are some important questions that I've been asking as I've been preparing. Things like, what was ritualism? Why did it matter? Why did it provoke such a reaction? What does it reveal about what Christians think Christianity is? And that is an important question on both sides of the ritualism argument. And I want to do and approach these questions in a way that feels honest and real. So I'm going to have to do two things at once. And the historian in me quite likes these two things. First, we need to do a sympathetic account, and not doing that because I want to convince you of ritualism's goodness, but because I'm trying to understand from their perspective. And then we're going to have to do what's more of a critical account, because the story has hard edges and difficult bits to understand. And I'm not asking anyone to agree with my assessment, because history is about thinking and interpreting for yourself. So history really is about the exciting thing of different interpretations. And within that broader context, I'm not asking you to become Anglo-Catholic. I'm not asking you to be a Protestant. I'm not asking you to be anything. I'm asking you to look and to listen and to let the weirdness of the past correct our understanding, because I think if we let it, then it really will do that. So let's start at the beginning. When a lot of people hear Victorian ritualism, they often imagine incense and candles and vestments and eastward-facing altar on position of the priest at confessions, saints' days, and maybe an extra few sort of bonus Latin phrases thrown in for, I don't know, dramatic effect. And people that think that aren't really, they're not just as what might you call them, people in the comments. They're not just people glibly, instantly thinking. Because actually, a lot of the time, even academic writing on ritualism gets treated like this. It's as something you can define by what it looks like, by the sort of visible and audible stuff. So the next assumption then becomes, well, maybe it's just aesthetics, or it's just theatre, or it can be seen as superstition, or a secret cloaked Catholicism. And because it's the 19th century, and this is the time of Dickens, etc., it can also feel like another weird world. And like we're watching a costume drama unfold. And especially when over time the mainstream church in Britain particularly has become lower in its ecclesiastical style and more progressive in its posture, and sometimes with a kind of instinct that it wants to look more like the world, or at least maybe not unlike it. And Victorian ritualism doesn't do that at all. It doesn't look like the world. It doesn't look at the world and go, this is what I want to be like. It looks at the world around it and goes, I want to be different. And this was not a mistake. It was a deliberate plan. Perhaps we could say it was the point. But look, sometimes the critique of ritualism is not wrong, because sometimes it was theatre, and sometimes it was about the identity, sometimes it was about the priest and the sort of badge that you wear, and sometimes it really was a kind of we are better than you posture, particularly for people like Dolling, Father Robert Dolling, the idea that Calvinistic Anglicanism was a dead religion, and that he definitely thought he was better than them, and that his Christianity was better than his main enemies in Lamport, with religious enemies, as it were, seemed to be the Salvation Army. Victorian life and church life was no different. It had snobbery, and it was full of factions, and there was a sort of smattering of vanity. It had men who liked being controversial, and men who liked attention, men who liked power. And I think we can say that absolutely truthfully. But if we stop there, then we don't understand why certain ideas spread, and we don't understand why the cost for these priests was so high. And maybe we struggle to grasp why it created institutions that really lasted. But the main thing I think we then don't understand, if we stop at that point, is we don't understand why it terrified respectable Christian Protestant England. Because the thing ritualism represented is not actually mainly a style, it was a claim about the very nature of Christianity. And that claim is what we need to understand. Here's the simplest way I think I can say it is ritualism is the insistence that Christianity is not just true in the head, but it's sort of habitual in the body, or perhaps more plainly, ritualism assumes that Christian faith is not merely a set of options, but it's a pattern of life and a rhythm and a rule, and not a rule in the way that Ugo was saved by the rules, but rule as in a way of organizing time, a way of giving structure so that your days don't just finish you off. And inside slum parishes, that feels crucial. It feels crucial because, it was a way of organizing the body so that worship isn't only a feeling, it was a feeling, but not just a feeling. And it's a way of organizing the parish so that mercy isn't, occasional limited charity, but is a normal way of life. And I think you can see that most clearly when ritualism is pushed into these places where life is under maximum strain. And that's why I'm drawn to these slum priests, because it is the slums and the dockyards and the industrial parishes. It's not the rural areas. And it's the place where families don't have a lot of margin in money and time and energy. Because when life is already fragile, a weak version of Christianity won't hold you firm. A Christianity in that context that exists as only words just won't remain. So there can't be a place for Sunday Christian performance because it won't stand. And this is what makes the ritualism, that elaborate expression of Christianity, so incredible, that it worked in these places, but it couldn't have just been Sunday performance. So ritualism in these contexts become a form of what I like to call survival theology. And it's not because ritual saves you, it's because ritual helps stabilize you and it gives your day something to cling on to, maybe a spine. And this is the spine, as it were, of the whole series. It cuts two ways: dignity and control, mercy and power. And we're going to keep those sort of two edges in view the whole time. And, you know, maybe that can make ritualism seem cold or controlling, but it can also be mercy. And the whole series is really going to be about that tension. But let me explain one of the big ideas here, hopefully without using jargon. Now, I did get a comment from a friend the other day that I tend to say these long words and assume that people know what they are. I promise you, I'm not trying to do that. And if you do think that, then do let me know, and let me know which words I need to explain a bit better. But I'm going to try and do this as much as I can without jargon. But I would also say, if you're watching this, you're attached to a computer, excuse me, you're attached to a computer, you are more than welcome to pause me and look up, or let me continue and look up any words and what they mean. So, ritualism is driven by what you might call a sacramental realism. And that means, you don't need to pause me because I'm going to tell you, God is not only met in the mind, he's not just up here, but God meets us through material and physical things. Think about it: through bread and wine, water, oil, and then words specifically spoken aloud, something that enters you, and the hands that are laid on your heads, and your body as you kneel, and then your body as you receive Christ and the elements. And if that's true, then worship is not this optional add-on decoration. It's the place where, and careful how we say this, because this has been abused, I think, by contemporary extreme charismatic movements. But it is the place, this in the slums in the 19th century, in these beautiful churches, in this where these material things were being experienced. It is the place where heaven touches earth and that God touches people. And I know that sentence, or those sentences, really can make us nervous because some of us hear it and we think, oh, danger or works or Rome or suspicion. I'm not going to really argue that out in this episode. We'll look at that going forward. But I am going to say this: whatever your tradition, the Christian faith is not a shadow chasing religion. It is always an incarnational faith. Christianity, no matter what stripe, is the idea is central to it that God took on flesh. So the instinct that says, like I'm saying, that bodies actually are important and they matter is not random. Because the question is how the body is disciplined and how it is guarded and how the whole idea of embodiment is prevented from becoming magic. Because the real danger is this, that ritualism can become superstition, and ritual can become manipulation, and ritual can become do this to get that. But ritual can also become the opposite. It can become a schoolmaster of gratitude. It can become a way of receiving grace without constantly needing new emotion. Again, as I think about charismatic Christianity, that constant need for the new thing, the new feeling, the bigger this, the brighter that it's not needed in ritualism because it's a way of receiving grace without constantly needing that. And that's why the poor, especially the poor, often found it compelling, because emotion is costly. And it's more costly if your life is exhausted and you can't manufacture sort of a spiritual intensity on demand. But maybe you can go to a table and you can kneel and you can receive and you can be carried by something older than how you feel. And that is the survival theology of the slums in the cities of England in the 19th century. So the question is that could be going through your head is, why am I doing this series on ritualism through the slum priests of the 19th century? And the answer is because they expose the real stakes. Because if you think about it, in a real wealthy parish, you can pretend that ritualism is about taste or choice. But in a slum parish, you cannot do that because everything is tested more. Because it becomes important, what does your worship produce and what does your theology create and what does the church actually do with broken, tired, worn down human beings? And if your high church is just a costume, it might survive in affluent parts of rural and even industrial and city 19th century England. But if your high church is just that costume, it will not survive in the docklands. And if it's just a preference, how can it survive cholera if it's just, oh, I prefer this to that? You have to be so invested. And if it's just a hobby, it will never survive the conflict that came. So the slum priests, in that sense, are like the stress test. They show you what ritualism does when it has to become an institution and a home and a system of mercy. And that's why the names that I love and I'm drawn to, like Lauder and Stanton and Dolling and McConaughey and others, they keep appearing. And it's not because they're flawless heroes, they're absolutely not, but because they lived ritualism as if it was a complete version of Christianity. And that is what attracted people and provoked the huge backlash. Let's think about what it might have looked like, because in the slum priest world, ritualism isn't only a candle on an altar or incense in the sanctuary or a choral service done beautifully. It's a mission house where people can come and feel safe, and it's a table where people are fed, and a club where boys are kept off the street. It's a school, a visiting system, a sickbed ministry, and a way of dealing with death that doesn't deny it. It's also confession, not as a form of control, but as mercy to the broken, and daily prayer that isn't just performed, but is a rhythm of life. And it's the Eucharist, not as a decorative piece, but as food that helps you remain and stay. And you can feel how heavy that is, I think. It's not just a Sunday service, it's a whole world. And that's why people loved it and why people feared it. Because when a church becomes a world, it begins to compete with other worlds. When a church isn't just Sunday, it has to compete with broader society. It competes with pubs, with gangs, with employers and political movements. And maybe for some, particularly in thinking of Portsmouth, it's those down in Southsea with, it competes with respectable middle class control. And the slum priest doesn't simply say, come to church. He says, come under the care of this church. And that is a much bigger claim. And it created and creates even today at times real conflict. So let's talk about the hatred, because actually it was absolutely real. The anti-ritualist movement didn't happen because everyone was bored. Victorian society wasn't really a place where people got bored. Um, I think it happened mainly because ritualism threatened things. It threatened Protestant identity, which was quite strong, and it also threatened this national British or perhaps English identity because it had a whiff of the continent, and it threatened a certain idea of the English religion. But it also threatened episcopal control sometimes. It really threatened the hierarchy of the Church of England because these priests were often stubborn. They didn't always take orders well. And then there were some deeper fears. I think I've identified five. And the first fear is Rome. Those that studied religious history, for them it was a memory of the history of persecution of foreign power and political dominance. The second fear is this priestcraft, the idea that priests could use ritual to control people. The third 19th century fear is the fear that what if the poor were being mobilized? And there were, we see with people like Stuart Headlam, who had his socialist leanings, and they saw that this was an opportunity to educate the poor, to get them to rise up against the capitalist system. And this wasn't always said openly in every church, but it was there. And a church that becomes a world for the poor creates a kind of loyalty that respectable society can no longer control. The fourth one really is the combination and the accusations relating to sex and secrecy, but not in the modern post-scandal sense and not in the idea of predator priests, but as like a standard Victorian talking point. It was more like this, that private confession and celibacy and convents, and that feeling that Rome creates hidden spaces where ordinary English accountability can't reach. And so therefore, yes, in the Victorian imagination, this often slid into a sort of innuendo that ritualists mocked as unmanly or even perverted, but perverted in the Victorian term, meaning to be turned or converted. And this is around the time that within perverted, those sexual echoes started to creep into that word. And the whole thing is sort of treated as morally weird and a bit suspect. But I do want to say this, and I want to say it really carefully, because some modern writers and scholars are more interested in making that sexual subtext the main key for Victorian slum priest ritualism. The many Victorians were happy to state. And I think that's really important because the evidence for the sexual sort of differences compared to what you would expect in a priest are so scant. There's much more argument from silence. So things like the celibacy and the manly Christianity is one of the things that really pushes these people. But I think we might do an episode on that in this series going forward, because it's one of the biggest for me, it's one of the biggest sadnesses is that in trying to find perhaps new angles, we come up with this idea that there is a um, immorality, a Victorian version of immorality inside these priests, and therefore we can neglect them. But I cannot, I've read basically all I can find and read, and I cannot see the interpretations of those people. So, but in the 19th century, it was often coded, I think, so sort of shame language and secrecy language of being effeminate, that kind of thing, rather than the explicit categories we see now. But I say this, a lot of those accusations and those thoughts were panic, and a lot were maybe projection, but it matters because it shaped what the public thought they were seeing when they saw a candle. So throwing suspect on this celibate priest who hang around with men a lot appears to be quite a good way to suggest that they weren't as holy and set apart as they liked to say. And I think part of that comes from that ritual expression of there's a lot of secrecy and a lot of um, sort of hiding, and a lot of things are done what felt like more in secret, and there's a lot of weirdness and a lot of things people didn't understand. The fifth and final fear was it was really important to those inside the hierarchy and those who were sort of theologically astute, because there was a somewhat a different theology of salvation, and some Protestants felt genuinely that ritualism obscured justification by faith alone and replaced it with a dependency on the sacraments. And some of those fears were plainly irrational, and some were unfair, and some were malicious. But there were times when they were not imaginary, because ritualism did at times blur the lines, and some ritualists did drift, and a few did convert to Rome, and some developed a tone of contempt for Protestants inside their same movements, and some did speak as if real Christianity only involves and only began with Catholic order. So part of being honest is saying that um, the backlash wasn't totally insane, but also the backlash often misunderstood what ritualism was doing in the slums. It saw candles, but it didn't see the perseverance and the staying. It saw robes, but it didn't see the beds and the security at night. And it sees confession, but it didn't see the mercy and the help that that gave to the sin that so easily entangles. And that mismatch is a huge part of our story, because what we have when we look at the data is we've got a load of things in favor of the slum priests. We've got the writings of themselves, and the sermons, and the support, and their biographies and memoirs when they died, all in support of them, apart from Lauder's is more interesting. And then we've got people like John Tomlinson, who hated ritual itself and attacked it. So, like the Protestant Alliance and Protestant organizations speaking against it. So, what we don't have in the 19th century is many people going, ritualism, that was kind of okay. I can take it or leave it. You would tend to come down on one side or the other. Anyway, this is now about the tension that I flagged earlier, that ritualism in the slum priest world has two edges. The first edge is dignity, because it says that the poor deserve beauty and they deserve reverence, they deserve clean spaces, and they deserve a full Christianity, not a cut down, simple, easy version. And that's really why they built beautiful churches in rough areas. And that's why they insisted on good quality sounding worship. And that's why they poured money into buildings and music and altars instead of the um, just keeping it whitewashed and simple. I think they were saying something like, God is not only for respectable people, and that the poor are not a problem to be solved, but they are heirs of a kingdom. So they believe that a church should look like that kingdom. And I think that's really powerful. But then there's the second edge of this sword, which is control. Because when you start building a world for the poor, you can perhaps slide into this sort of paternal ism. You can slide into we know best, the middle class savior, the middle class hero. You can slide into discipline and becoming harsh. You can slide into the poor being treated as a project rather than as equals. And sometimes, even with good intentions, the lines get crossed. So we can't, in this series, romanticize it. We can't do, which some people have, the Saints of the Slums series. We need to keep our eyes open, but we also can't sneer, because many modern Christians have replaced paternalism with neglect. They pride themselves of not being controlling, and they end up offering nothing that's deep enough to help anyone. So again, there are two edges, and this series, I really hope to bring those two together. I want to argue in this series against a modern misreading that ritualism is basically a Victorian taste movement, or a church version of art for art's sake. I mean, yes, there's obviously some overlap, because there is that Victorian aesthetic world. There is fascination with beauty, a fascination with medievalism. Look at the Houses of Parliament and the changes and the buildings that are being built. And around that time, in the mid to late 19th century, there is a love of all things medieval. And part of what they love is they love that atmosphere. And here's what I think. In the slum priest world, beauty is rarely just about taste, because it's about this moral claim. It's actually saying, if you live in filth and ugliness all week, the church should not mirror that. The church should be otherly. Not otherly as in posh, but otherly as in clean and holy and held in high esteem. And beauty becomes a way of saying, you in the slums have not been abandoned by the Church of England. Although it often felt like they've been abandoned by the Church of England, because it is these slum priests who we know by name that actually come and make the difference. But again, that can be abused, but it isn't trivial, because if we've ever been poor, then we can easily mock beauty. If we've lived in places where everything is broken, the beauty can be a kind of mercy, not because this beauty actually saves you, because it actually tells you something. It tells you, maybe silently or visually, that something matters, and eventually that you matter. And I think that is the ritualist instinct. And it's one reason that ritualism took hold in the slum areas. If I had to pick one single thread that runs through this whole series, it would be this. It's the theology of staying, of remaining, of staying in the parish, staying when it's dangerous, when it's unpopular, when it's mocked, and staying and remaining even when you're tired. Ritualism in the Slum Priest parish is not mainly about expressing yourself. It is about this endurance because the parish is not a platform, it's an actual place, and places don't change necessarily because of speeches. They change because of long obedience. I guess with the speeches, it depends who's making it. If you've shown endurance and staying, then you have more of a say. So long obedience, showing up, being there at the right times. It's about morning prayer, evening services, visiting clubs and schools. It's all those small things that are staying made visible. And ritualism is often the tool that makes staying possible. It's not always, but often. And the priests didn't always get this right. But ritualism gives the priest and the parish a structure that outlasts the personality. Again, we can dislike it, and we should also recognize that what it actually is. And it's Christianity rich enough to remain. And that brings us again back to this is about survival theology. Now, let me say why I think you should care, because you might be watching this thinking, that's fine, interesting history, but why now? How does this help? And here's why. We are in an age in the West of thin and shallow and sometimes meaningless Christianity. And I don't only mean liberal Christianity, I mean thin Christianity across the spectrum. Thin as in every church, lots of opinions, thin as in online conflict. This loads of identity signaling and all these sort of, hey, Christianity's a vibe, and there's loads of branding, and the world is full of content, and we can pick and choose the bits that we like, but there isn't much sort of institutional steadiness. The question is, where is the stability? Do we have the ability to hold a life together? Where is the capacity in the church to endure pressure? And what the ritualists expose is how weak that is, particularly today. Because listen, they didn't have the internet. They didn't even have the modern welfare state, and they didn't have modern medicine, and they didn't have modern housing, but they built worlds and worlds that could be oppressive or life-giving, and they were often a mix, but they built and they continue to build, and modern churches often can't do that. What we can do today often is we can argue online about theology for 3 hours and then fail to visit the sick next door. Now, I'm not actually against long videos. The last video I watched, or one of my favorite latest videos on YouTube, was 5 hours and 50 minutes long. What I'm saying is that I am against doing that only if we do not visit the sick or love our neighbors or care for our family. I hope that makes sense. So I'm saying, look, you can watch and you can argue and you can discuss. And I've got friends that I love doing that with, but that can't be all you do. Because, yeah, we have strong opinions, some of us, about sound doctrine, and then we can have no shared discipline that teaches us and trains and helps us to love one another. We can have high aesthetics and a sense of the beauty without any mercy, and we can have a church full of activism without true worship, or we can have worship concerts that are individualistic and there's no community. And I think ritualism forces a question, particularly Victorian slum priest ritualism. It asks these questions: what kind of Christianity can survive real life? What kind of Christianity can carry the poor and the exhausted and the grieving? But that question is not only Victorian, that's a question across all ages. So, yes, I mean, let's be honest, I'm a historian. So, this is history, but it's history that judges us today, not because Victorians better, they actually weren't, but because they were trying to solve problems we've largely stopped trying to solve. They were willing to pay the costs we often avoid. And that is why this series exists. So the question is, where do we go from here? We'll do more episodes actually that are more focused, and I will do a post that will explain the episodes going forward. We will look at priests like Lauder and Stanton, Dolling, McConaughey, Headlam, and Linklater, but we'll also look at sickness because that can be the real test. And we need to look at conflict because the backlash is not this sort of footnote or endnote. It's not an addition, it's part of the process. And it was contemporary. And we'll look at buildings and money because money can act like theology in physical form. And we'll look at the way the poor were treated for good and for ill by these systems that were meant to bring mercy. And we'll keep asking the same question: is this dignity or control? Is this grace or power? Is this holiness or performance? And my suspicion is that the answer will be yes to all of those questions. And that's why I think it's worth studying, because Christian history is rarely tidy, but it is often instructive. So, Victorian ritualist, slum priest life wasn't about lace, not at its deepest, not at the places that actually mattered. It was an attempt to build a Christianity thick enough to hold real lives together. It was a survival theology, a way of saying grace is not only an idea, but grace lives. It lives in a parish, in a timetable, around a table. It lives in the rule of life, in a world that doesn't collapse when the mood changes. And that is what ritualism was trying to do. And that attempt created beauty, and it created conflict, and it created institutions, and it created mistakes. And that is what we're going to look at, because if we only ever study the past to congratulate ourselves, then I don't think we really learn anything. And if we only ever study the past to sneer, we also learn nothing. But if we study it to see what Christians thought Christianity was and what it produced, then we might come away with a harder, better question. What kind of Christianity am I building? What does my faith actually do during the week to a family, to the poor, to the exhausted, to the places that don't get fixed quickly? Because that is the real test. It isn't lace and candles, and it isn't beauty. It's staying. This is Empire of the Sun. I'm Matthew. God bless.